Welcome to Leiden University, the campus The Hague. My name is Ernst Dijkzoorn. I'm the director of the Crisis and Security Master here at Leiden. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Security and Global Affairs, HCSS, the War Studies Research Center at the NLDA, and the KVBK. A couple of years ago, when I started here in the Netherlands, we wouldn't have been able to fill this room for events like this. Probably would have been like 10, 15 people showing up. Now I fully realize that it's not our doing of the Institute or of the organizations who organize this, that there is so much attention to matters that have to do with war and warfare. That's probably more to do with the geopolitical situation. But I have to say that the cooperation between the think tanks, the university, organizations like the KVBK, the last couple of years, with the changing geopolitical situation, also advanced massively and made things like this possible. So thank you very much for being here. Apart from that, I just have a couple of announcements. This book was the result of an extremely well-organized Future of War conference about a year and a half ago. The highlight of which was the reception at the Rijksmuseum, but the speakers were also very good. And they wrote very good chapters in this book debating the future of war, edited by Tim and Jeff. Today we will start with a 45-minute fireside chat with Rob de Wijk, Jeff Michaels and Tim Sweijs, the editors of this book. We will then have a round table with some of the authors, who can sit on the first row if they want to. Jan Willem. Frans Oosinga, Marijn Hoytink, Jan-Willem Honig, Paul van Hoofd, Kristen Arnold, and moderated by Isabel Duivenstein. After which there will be ample time for Q&A, so you can ask the authors all the questions you always wanted to know about the future of war. And then you can tackle them at the drinks at Pavlov, here at Plein, sponsored by the organization, where you can continue the debate on the future of war. Between going to Pavlov and the round table, you are able to buy the book outside here, as long as the stock lasts. Be quick, because there's not enough for all of you. And there is a 40% discount just today for the quick decider. We probably have to say, like, there's a maximum of 10 books that you can buy per person. 2, sorry. And if you want, you can have it signed by the editors or the authors, although that does diminish the resale value of the book. So I wouldn't do that if I were you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here, Rob, Tim, and Jeff. And please start your fireside chat.
Yes. This will be a fireside session without a fire, but that doesn't matter. This, ladies and gentlemen, everyone, this is a great book. I read it with interest. The Financial Dagblad, the Financiële Dagblad in this country, it's the equivalent of the Financial Times in the UK, wrote that this is mandatory reading for each and every official, and thank God I see quite a lot of them in the room. So that's fine, and I agree with that observation. The Ukraine war is really a reality check. Many believed that this was something from the past, and yet it happened. Civilization has advanced, and we became postmodern. Security was no longer seen in terms of territorial integrity, but in terms of the security of groups of people, human security. And war was considered something of the past. It was an instrument that was not being used again anymore by politicians and generals. This has led, over the last decades, to a neglect of war studies, and I think this really fills a gap. At universities, war studies gave way to peace studies, but peace is really hard to find nowadays. I know from my own experience at this university that people were still interested in the hard side of international politics, in realism, in how to fight wars, how to do coercion. It was still popular. If you look at the minor we organized at this university, it's one of the most popular minors. And that is no coincidence. So what happened, in my view, is that there was a neglect within society in general, but also among officials, that it should only, that war was no longer something that should be discussed. It should be peace that should be discussed. Now this is going to change, and now we have this book, and we will talk about it. And let me start by raising one question, which was really on my mind when I read this book. It reads like a déjà vu, as the Americans call it. I studied war for ages, and now we have this book, and we didn't really make good progress, because war is raging in Ukraine, in the Middle East. Peace is not guaranteed. Great power politics are alive and kicking. And with respect to war fighting, the same mistakes are made all over again. What is this? What did we do wrong? Why can't we learn from the past? Jeffrey?
How do we learn from the past? Why don't we learn from the past?
Why don't we learn from the past? Not how can we learn from the past? How can we learn from the past? This is a typical question for scholars. And we should do that. But why don't we do it? Why do we make the same mistakes all over again?
Well, for one thing, the future of war is somebody else's problem. It's not my problem today, it's somebody else's problem tomorrow. I think one of the key things that we see, for example, when we look at the war in Ukraine and looking at various, how different military establishments are adapting towards that and so forth, what lessons are we learning today? Is it actually too soon to learn lessons already or not? I mean, this is a war that's still very much in progress, and are the lessons of the Ukraine war from, say, the end of 2022 the same that we should still be thinking about at the end of 2023, or even looking ahead towards the end of 2024, what's going to be happening next year, for example. So we're not quite at the end yet to look back on and say we need to adapt accordingly. So there's quite a lot there, I think, that we still need to reflect on, that's already happened, but also that's sort of still in progress.
But Tim, is it about lessons learned or lessons noticed? Usually I have the impression that it's about lessons noticed. What is this?
Now you touch upon a very important issue, which is that why do we study wars? And I think war studies is always, whether it's implicit or explicit, about studying war in order to learn lessons, in order to better prepare for future war. And that can be in order to prevent it, it can be in order to deter your opponent from waging it, it can be in order to, once war breaks out, in order to defeat your opponent. So there is this practical side, which is also, of course, reflected in this book, to the study of war, which is its preoccupation with the future. I always have been fascinated not just with war, but also with the future and our ability to anticipate and predict the future of war. When I started my career in 2006, 2007, I quickly found out that despite the fact that military organizations fight for the survival of their nations, despite the fact that they spend worldwide over $2,000 billion, last year $2,400 billion on defense, there's only a very tiny community that focuses on what lessons can be learned in order to prepare for the future, and also in financial terms, that is very, very, very small. Back then, we started with HCSS, and defense organizations asked us to engage in these large foresight, learning from current wars, learning from past wars, looking at trends and scenarios in external environment, and then deduce risks and also potential enemies that we could fight. While doing so, I noticed that many on the government side were only there for sort of a 3-year stint before they went on to take up a command somewhere or become an ambassador in a faraway country. And then I'm talking a little bit about the genesis of this book. And so from then onwards, I decided to develop a course on the future of war. Frans Ozinga asked me whether, in addition to HCSS, I wanted to join the Netherlands Defense Academy. So we set up a course on the future of war to not necessarily predict the future, but to teach students at the Master in Military Strategic Studies, but also the Advanced Staff Command courses, how to think about the future. How can you study wars, and let's talk about that, in a meaningful way, so that you can deduce lessons for the future in order to wage it. Now that was, I think we taught it this year for the 4th or 5th time. We presented our book last year to the Dutch Chief of Defense, and one of my former students was his political advisor. So we're having an impact there, if you like. And then we hosted this conference and brought together 16 chapters. I'm not going to use the word of the best and brightest, but of very fascinating and interesting authors, a bunch of whom are gathered here today, in which he specifically asked the question, now, pivoting to your question, Rob, are there things that we can learn from the current war? And there are things we can learn from the current war.
Yes, I think the other issue, and one idea that was really central to the book, was seeing this difference between what were the visions of the future of war prior to the 24th of February 2022, and how have they changed since then? What things are we seeing now that we weren't seeing then? And this sort of alludes to your point earlier. If you go back, say, 10 years, 15 years, it was all about insurgencies and terrorism. Then it sort of moves on to a bit of hybrid war, interest in that, cyber war, interest in drones and so on and so forth, but the idea that you'd actually have a major war of the sort that we're seeing now, it was too far-fetched for anybody to really seriously think about. Of course, after 2014, NATO was gearing towards some sort of conventional war scenario, but I don't think anybody was really thinking along the lines of what we've seen in the last couple of years.
No, that's true. On the other hand, we have a war going on in Gaza, and that is pretty much a counterinsurgency operation. It has all the elements of unconventional warfare. So we should not neglect that one, should we?
No, this is the other problem, is that there are just lots of types of wars.
Exactly.
But the problem, of course, is that from a purely bureaucratic perspective, military organizations can only do so much. Right. Now some countries are very lucky. They only have one big enemy to fight, and that's who they train to fight, and that's what they're concerned about. Others, for example, a lot of countries within the NATO alliance, they're concerned about all sorts of things, all sorts of things, the 360-degree approach, and so forth. So the high-end stuff, the low-end stuff, and everything in between.
But what does this mean? How to bridge the gap? Because I think this is important. If the war stops in Ukraine, then probably it will continue in the occupied territories as unconventional warfare. So how can you bridge the gap then between the different types of war? Do you have a solution for that in this book?
Well, yes. We don't have a quick fix, but essentially one of the key messages here is that we need to engage in a fundamental societal rethink of what war is, without only focusing on the war in Ukraine as the single template for the future of war. And so we have a number of chapters, Frans Ozinga's surveys, 30 years of visions of future war. We have Frank Hoffman talking about cognitive war, societal war, proxy war, in addition to conventional war. We also have David Betts, who makes a very provocative argument, saying that all these large defense organizations, they only talk about the big stuff, and they want to go back to their big ticket items, whether it's F-35s or frigates or what have you. Whereas he claims we're living at the last vestiges of Western society, and what we're going to see is intrastate war, large-scale insurgencies, and then in our world, right, in the Western world.
Now there's actually a film playing, that's Civil War.
And and that is my baby daughter, who I also invited to the. So essentially, Rob, the key point here is that yes, there is a lot of lessons to be gleaned. One, we thought conventional war was over, and we thought that if conventional war would return, it would be sort of part of a sort of Star Wars, sci-fi, Netflix series in which everything would fly and automatically connect.
But why is this? I always have the impression that technology push is very important here. That we think in terms of technology and not in terms of how future war really can be fought. What is this?
Well, who's future war? I mean, there are all sorts. Everybody has their own type. I mean, if you're talking about Israel, they have their wars that they prepare for and so forth.
I understand that, but the question is why do we have those fancy ideas about the future of war? We had huge discussions on Star Wars, and never materialized. That was in the 1980s. Then we focused only on unconventional warfare, and we tried to solve it with technology. Now we have this, and we try to solve it with technology, because we have huge discussion about the role of drones, and everyone is talking about game changers, but there were no game changers in this war. What is this? What is a lesson to be learned from this?
Well, war is a human thing. Technology is an instrument, but is not the end all. It also says something about. Look, war is a reflection of a broader social, cultural, political, economic context in which it is fought. If we, from our Western advanced societies, think about war, we're so unused to blood being spoiled. We're so focused on mobile technology that if we think about war, we also start to think about it being done in a sort of technocratic way. And now I think we're finding out that that is not the case. Again, by the way, because, I mean, if you go 100 years back in history, the same would apply. Did you want to cut in there, Jeff?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just going to say that, I mean, at the end of the day, most modern military bureaucracies are filled with technological fetishists. I mean, that's just a state of affairs. Now, that's not to say that technology isn't important. Of course it's important. It's extremely important. Likewise, military organizational issues and strategy and posture and so forth. But at the end of the day, you have to place that within a much broader context, so the broader social context. What happens when norms change, when things that we thought were, things that we had accepted as the norm.
You're not going to go to war, for instance.
Not going to go to war, or, for example, this idea of casualties. Yeah. I mean, look what we're seeing in Ukraine today, hundreds of thousands of casualties. We thought that we were beyond this. I mean, it was just inconceivable that this could be the case.
We thought or we wished?
I think both. I mean, I think we wished it, but I also think we honestly thought so. Bearing in mind the former US Secretary of State saying, you're not going to behave in the 21st century as if it's the 19th, right? So
yeah, that was during the Crimea crisis.
Exactly. So that's already a decade ago. But I wanted to add another point. Before we go sort of off on a rant bashing technology, I mean, to some extent, the future doesn't arrive immediately, it arrives in bits and pieces. And so, like in the early 1990s, where we saw the first instances of the US leveraging the tools of the information revolution vis-à-vis Iraq, and the visions of battle clouds and everything being connected only coming to some sort of maturation 30 years later, I think what we're currently seeing, or I mean, you could talk about the First World War and the introduction of the tank, and then 20 years later, blitzkrieg tactics, these sorts of things. I mean, I think perhaps a similar logic, and now I'm speculating, but I'm taking a step back and looking at things as they develop, is happening here. We see a lot of experimentation with unmanned systems, with algorithms. We're seeing that they're actually being applied, right, in the OODA loop, from observe, orient, to decide, but actually also to act. I think we have seen lethal autonomous weapon systems in action, and news is sipping through that is the case. But that thus far only has tactical effects and hasn't scaled up to the strategic level. And as Jeff just said in the beginning, I mean, it's in Dutch we say it's not evening yet, right? It's not yet evening. And so it may very well that over the next year, 2 years, we see that tactical experimentation scaling up and leading to actual strategic breakthroughs on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is when I say, the war ain't over yet, I mean, when we started with the war, 2 years ago, there was a great deal of concern that there would be nuclear weapons used in this war. In fact, there still is. Now, just imagine if some tactical nuclear weapons were used, say, 6 months from now or 9 months from now or something like this. We'd be having a very different conversation now than we are having. We'd have to not quite rewrite the book, but we'd have to look at things very, very differently for sure.
Then we can write really something new.
Yes.
Because that hasn't happened yet.
No, it hasn't happened yet, but again, so much is based on certain assumptions, that the nuclear taboo will not be broken. It will not go away. So, if you take away some of those assumptions, then you're in a different world entirely.
Is there a chapter on this in the book, Tim?
On what precisely? On the nuclear element? I'm afraid we have to disappoint you there, Bob.
Yes.
Why do you have to disappoint me here?
Because I know you wrote your PhD on nuclear weapons about 40 years ago.
No, but it's a real question. Why didn't you do that?
No, it is an important question. I mean, look, it's a book that's already runs 366 pages long.
I should say that in fairness, we do have one chapter, the Armageddon chapter, that does address the nuclear issue a bit. Well, this is Jennifer Mitchell's chapter, and she goes through these various scenarios of sort of the Armageddon scenarios, one of which is the nuclear one. And so what are the risks of nuclear use in this war or at some future point in time? And how have we been talking about the nuclear issue in ways that were pretty much inconceivable before the war? I mean, again, just the level of interest in the issue and the seriousness with which we've been talking about it, not just in terms of the public, but in government, for sure. I mean, the amount of, the number of scenarios that we play these days and so forth about nuclear use of one sort or another. I mean, it's
also the neglect in the public debate.
Yes. I mean, apart from a few scares, you've had a few points in time since the war began when you've had a few different scares. For example, in, I think it was October. Sorry. No worries. Say, I think it was October of 2022, for example. There was this big fear that Ukraine was making a number of advances on the ground, and that maybe Russia would actually use a nuclear weapon. We've just seen last week a sort of tactical nuclear exercise in the southern military district right next to Ukraine. So the nuclear issue hasn't gone away. I mean, I think I'm relatively calm at the moment. We'll see what happens with the U.S. election and the response to that, and so forth. But so I'm not expecting anything right away. But it is a concern. It's something that's gone from being more or less impossible to being probably improbable. But still, that's dangerous enough.
In October, what was it? 22, eh?
Yes.
There was this discussion about the possibility of nuclear use. Then the White House made an assessment, and their conclusion was that it was a 50-50 chance that Putin would use nuclear weapons, and that has led to consultations in Ankara. But
yes,
that's a different story. But so it's real, and here again you see the ignorance or the neglect also among politicians, which I think is even more frightening than the threat of nuclear weapons. But that's another discussion. So one of the themes in your book is about technology and technological innovation. Tim, what is the main conclusion here?
It depends.
It depends. That's a fantastic,
No, but literally,
fantastic answer.
Yes, we talk about a disruptive role of technology with a number of very interesting chapters on this, right? So speaking about the lessons that we can learn from history, specifically historical parallels. So we've Audrey Cronin, who writes a brilliant chapter, I would wholeheartedly recommend it, who argues that we're living through an era which is comparable to, let's say, the late 19th century, in which you had these innovators sitting in their basements, tinkering, the age of tinkering, she calls it. And whether it's Nobel with dynamite or I'm thinking of the Wright brothers experimenting with their airplane. That era is now coming back, she argues, to the extent that with do-it-yourself biology, with first-person view drones, with algorithmic applications that you can then combine with physical systems, there's all sorts of applications and experimentation taking place, which goes much faster than our large-scale R&D bureaucratic procedures that the ministries of defense do. So she argues that it has, in fact, a very disruptive effect and that there's much to be gleaned or much to be learned from it. But then we also have a very relevant contribution by Marijn Hoytink and Linde Arends and Lauren Gold, who argue that future of war is being created as we speak, not by large military-industrial complexes, but by people and the new ETEC military-industrial complex who work together with MODs to create that future. And if you look at what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, there's definitely more than a grain of truth to that. We had the Palantir CEO over here in the Netherlands last year with the RIEM conference, who had some very interesting philosophical observations, but who in effect was creating the future of war as we speak on the battlefield. It depends, the role of technology. Two other contributions that I wanted to highlight is T.X. Hammes, an old Marine, he's rather old, I think he's in his 70s, working at the NDU, who talks about the defense-offense balance, and he's saying that battlefields become defense dominant because of transparency and precision munition. And then Paul van Hooft, my colleague here, makes a very controversial argument. He says that may very well be true, but if you look at it at a strategic level, then it's still the great powers, then specifically the Americans and the Chinese, who can deny their opponents the means to wage war and the ability to wage war by denying them theater access. So if I say it depends, and that is in line with the book that there is not one blueprint, not one template, but this is a very nuanced discussion, a kaleidoscopic discussion which touches on many different aspects.
And you need capabilities, sufficient capabilities. If not, you're also doomed to fail. And I think that is one of the discussions that is taking place now with respect to the Ukraine war. But yeah,
definitely.
This war that's taking place in Ukraine, is that a template for the future? What do you think?
It depends whose future. Again, I mean, I think one of the problems is that you can't just select one type of war and say that's going to be the template for the future. I think that's utter nonsense because we do lots of different types of wars. I mean, I'm sure that there'll be insurgencies to deal with and all the rest of it, cyber conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. You know, one of the big questions at the moment is to what extent does the war in Ukraine actually, is it something of a template for a potential war between the US and China over Taiwan, and what lessons can be drawn from that. And, you know, I would say that, the lessons seem to change year in, year out. Year one, it was if Ukraine puts up a good defense, then the Taiwanese could replicate that and put up a very good defense as well. You know, by the end of year two, it's actually, even though you've lost, Russia lost in year one or didn't achieve what it wanted to achieve, the fact that it could still mobilize and still wage war at the level that it's waging into year 2 or into year 3 or perhaps even to year 4, with the leadership still remaining in power despite all the hundreds of thousands of casualties and so forth, that's a very different lesson for a Chinese leader, for example, to take away.
Can you really compare the situation Taiwan and Ukraine? Because you may have noticed that Taiwan is a rather small island.
Oh yes, no.
Ukraine is more or less landlocked. You can have maneuver warfare. In Ukraine, you can't have that in Taiwan. Because then the Chinese should bring many tanks and other heavy weapon systems on shore. So again, and I know about the discussions, but I always doubt whether you really could compare and whether Ukraine would involve lessons for Taiwan.
No, look, I mean, trying to identify lessons that cross over so well is always a very, very tricky and dangerous thing to do. I mean, when we think about, early in 2022, we were still looking back to the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia and saying, what lessons can you bring from one to the other? No, they're very different theaters, they're different, very, very different adversaries and all the rest of it. I sort of appreciate that. Nevertheless, I think there's still some general themes that we can take away. Well, for the first, the most important one is that it's possible, that a war like that is no longer impossible in the way that we thought it was before. That, for me, is probably the most important one. The second one is, again, just going back to the level of casualties. I know I keep coming back to that, but I think it's absolutely fundamental that we are going back to this era where you can actually have this level of casualties and still continue fighting a large-scale war. Again, we're not quite at the level of the Second World War, in terms of those levels of casualties, but still they're extraordinarily significant. And this is also why I also hark back to the nuclear question as well. At what point do you sort of step over a certain line where actually nuclear use looks attractive? You're taking too many casualties on the battlefield, and therefore can we break the stalemate somehow by using a nuclear weapon? Yep. Again, we're not quite at that point yet, but it's something that we still need to be thinking about and be concerned about.
If you think back of Norman Angell and Bloch, like 125 years ago, they also purported war to be irrational or seemingly irrational. And here I think we need to do a rethink as to what we think would be irrational from our perspective, would be perfectly rational from another leader's perspective.
Yes, I mean, if I could just sort of follow up on that and going back to your point, I mean, one of the current discussions at the moment, something you hear quite a lot about, are these assessments that, in 3 to 5 years, Russia can be in a position again to launch some sort of offensive against NATO territory. I literally have no idea what that's based on, what sort of assumptions that's based on. I mean, again, it all depends on what do they want to do with their armed forces. I mean, basically, and this is a political question as well. If the objective is purely to more or less thumb their noses at NATO by showing that they can take some sort of military action across a NATO border and get away with it by retreating thereafter, not to hold territory over a long period of time or something like this, I'm sure they could do that tomorrow if they wanted to. It doesn't take 500,000 troops to do that. You can send 5,000 across, and that'll be enough.
That's horizontal escalation. I'm waiting for it.
Yeah,
it's a very real scenario nowadays. What should be the purpose of this book, Tim? What do you want? How influential should it be? What is the relation of this book, or should the impact be on war studies and strategic studies? What do you want?
Well, two things. Before we go to war studies, let's go to our societies. The war in Ukraine has been raging on for, 26, 27 months now. We've have increased our defense spending, and we've been sort of focusing on what's happening there and talking a lot. But if I look at the actual things that have changed, I think not that many things have changed. So I've been arguing for setting up I need to come up with a better title for it, but I call it a Commission of Contemporary Wars. and then have the Commission go to contemporary battlefields, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Gaza or whether it's Armenia, or whether it's a coming battlefield like Taiwan, to think about what are the dynamics here, what does it mean for our future preparations, and how can we start preparing for that, both in terms of prevention and preparation. That's sort of on the policy relevance side, right? Now, in terms of what it means for us as a discipline, for war studies, what I find interesting in war studies is that it is this multidisciplinary endeavor by nature, right? It's strategic studies, it's conflict studies, it's anthropology, it's sociology, and I started out by saying, always with this sort of practical, pragmatical focus. And that, in addition, has not always standed in good stead within Dutch academia, so to speak. I mean, I had to go to England to do war studies. Back then, you really couldn't do any security studies in the Netherlands. I mean, we can talk about some exceptions here and there. And now, we're here in this beautiful building in Leiden. There is a minor track, there is a war studies community, there's things going on in Breda. So I think Jeff even moved to the Netherlands recently because his wife got a job here. So what I hope it will do is give war studies that push. And sorry, I didn't talk about Utrecht and the stuff that you're doing there. Give war studies a push and establish it as a real field of study here in the Netherlands.
What would you like to add to this?
Yeah, no, I mean, all I would say is that one thing that we try to do is to paint with a very broad brush. I mean, yes, we focus on these issues of the technology issues and so forth, offense versus defense, but we also engage with the broader questions of, say, the decline of war thesis, and where are we with that at the moment? This idea of how do you anticipate future wars, and what does the past teach you, and where have we got it wrong in the past? And one very important chapter by Jan Willem dealing with the question of people's wars versus professional wars. So to what extent are the populations going to be much more involved directly in wars in the future versus what we've seen in the recent past, where it was the professionals who go off to Afghanistan or Iraq or something like this, and the populations left more or less at home to get on with their lives, not as much engaged in the war, as we see, for example, now with Ukrainian society or even Russian society, for that matter.
And how could you change it in Europe as a whole, for example, in this country? How to do it?
Well, to be frank, I've not been here that long, so I wouldn't want to make any...
Well, then you take Spain, where you all...
Well, Spain's an interesting case, actually, because, and I love complaining about the Spanish, because they've never even heard of Ukraine. And I'm not joking about that. I'm saying that when you...
This is being broadcast, huh, Jeff?
Yes.
You know that.
When you talk to most Spanish defense officials, they don't want to know about Ukraine. They want to know about the Maghreb, they want to know about the Sahel. They just don't care about what goes on the eastern flank. They just care about what goes on the southern flank, specifically sort of opposite their region. And so getting them to even be interested in the topic, much less adapt, would take an act of God, probably.
This is an interesting observation, and this is of course not new, because you see the same phenomenon in Portugal, but also in Italy. What are the consequences of this? Because you have different threat perceptions throughout Europe. That is quite visible already, and you can't ignore it, but what are the consequences of this? For example, for NATO?
Yes, no, I mean, I'm slightly less concerned about the consequences, provided, of course, that they give the political approval when the moment is needed. I mean, I think there's something to be said for a division of labor. If the Spanish want to focus on North Africa, that's fine. Somebody should be focusing on that. I'm not expecting the Estonians to do that, for example. But it's really a question of, if there is a big war, if Russia does attack, say, one of the Baltic states, It's making sure that those states that are not directly involved still give their political approval to set the rest of the system in motion and are not holding the rest of the system back. I think that's probably the biggest concern within the alliance, is that you have this interest, for example, among some countries. You mentioned Italy as well, Greece, I would probably add to that, France, depending on sort of the month, where they'll be more interested in certain types of conflicts, but not others. So, again, it's fine to be focused on the South, and, that's fine, but as long as they don't stop, say, defense planning and adaptation in the East, I think that's really the trick.
Okay, I think we have to round up. Tim, what is your most important message of this book, and what kind of conclusion would you draw?
I think it is high time, as we would say in Dutch, to have a healthy and informed debate about war. And for a very, very, very long time, at least over the past 30 years, I think our national and also our European debate on the future war, on the international security environment, has been very poorly developed. If you now look at what happened in, I'm not going to talk about 2007, but I am going to talk about 2014, with the shooting down of MH17 and with the annexation of Crimea, it is quite shocking that within a very limited amount of time, we went back to sort of business as usual. Now, I think this current war has been a real strategic shock. Perhaps leading, now I don't want to call it an overreaction, but you see that there has been a lot of attention on war and what it means and what's the risk of nuclear war and how can we prepare for it and these sorts of things. And what I hope, that this book does, and I think if you read it, that you agree that it does to a certain extent, because the individual authors that contribute their chapters have made very interesting contributions, is put that debate on a much more healthy footing by sort of zooming out, saying this is war, it is real, it can affect our security, it's not the only war that is out there. Now let's start thinking about what it means for us, for our preparations as a society, in order to both prevent it from happening, and if it happens, be able to actually fight in it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's interesting. You also mentioned the word overreaction. Sometimes I think that my next book, which will be written probably in 3 or 4 years' time, will be about overreaction by the West. That's my guess. Jeffrey, what is your guess? What is your main conclusion? What are your famous last words here?
I think there are those who drive change, there are those who emulate change, there are those who respond to change, and there are those who ignore the future and change at their peril. And it's just a matter of trying to find out where on that spectrum one sits, and who is actually driving the change, and are they driving the right sort of changes or not. I mean, within NATO, I think for most NATO members, it's more about emulating change as it is about driving change themselves. But as long as you're not in that last category of ignoring change and constantly preparing for wars that are long since past, as one often sees with some countries, they just don't want to change because it's too much work. And better just to continue on as before and just hope you get it right the next time, but really not willing to make the sort of investments to change and at least change the mindset. And I think this is probably the most important thing that we have seen, or that we should be hopefully seeing more of as a result of the war in Ukraine, is that change in mindset. Because others have changed their mindset, we need to adapt to that mindset as well and be more open to this sort of full spectrum of possibilities that we weren't before.
Thank you so much. Changing mindset, that is something that is extremely important. 1645, they should be proud of us.
Yes.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Jeff. It was really a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Let's change.
Okay, welcome to the second part of this afternoon's proceedings. We are going to try and dive more into the details of the book. Let me start by quickly introducing the panelists. I'm going to start way at the end of the table. Lieutenant Colonel Christen Arnold, Associate Professor in Cybersecurity and Cyber Operations at the Netherlands Defense Academy. And he's also speaking on behalf of Professor Paul Duchesne, who is the co-author of the chapter, who couldn't unfortunately be here with us today. Next up we have Marijn Hoytink, Associate Professor of International Relations at Antwerp University. We're very happy that you are here with us today, especially since it's your birthday. To my immediate right, colleague Dr. Paul van Hooft, Senior Strategic Analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. And then on my left, Professor Frans Ozinga, Professor of War Studies here at the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs. And at the far end, Professor Jan-Willem Honig, Professor of International Security Studies at the Netherlands Defense Academy. I'm particularly pleased that I'm sharing a panel with Professor Honig, because we were talking earlier about the field of war studies. And what we have here at the table is multiple generations of war studies scholars, because I was the first PhD student of Professor Honig a long time ago. And to put all my cards on the table, I was the PhD examiner of Dr. Sweijs. So there is a lot of hope for the development of the field here in the Netherlands. Multiple people here in the room had to go to the UK to study this fascinating topic of war. But there is progress visible. What I propose is the following. Oh, by the way, my name is Isabel Duivenstein. I'm a professor of international studies at the Humanities Faculty of Leiden University. I propose that we do two quick rounds around the table, and I have proposed two questions for consideration. And I've given the speakers, the panelists, a very limited amount of time to answer those questions, but they're intended to set us off on a course of conversation and exchange with the people in the audience. So the first question, and I'm going to ask you to stick to 3 minutes maximum. The first question is, how has the war in Ukraine affected your thinking about the future of war, and how has it informed your contribution to the edited volume? And the second one is echoing what we discussed earlier in the fireside chat, was what should we learn? Can we learn? What should we learn, or what should we not learn from the war in Ukraine? I'm going to stick to the order of the contributions in the book, so that will not be the logical order here behind the table. I'm going to be a very strict timekeeper, so if you've got 30 seconds left, I will raise my piece of paper, and when your time is up, I will try and stop you if you haven't stopped by then. First up, I'm going to ask Professor Ozinga to reflect on the question, how has the war on Ukraine affected your thinking about the future war? And your chapter addresses directly existing ideas about thinking about the future and actually mapping the future. The floor is yours.
Right. First of all, we need to be aware that when we think about the future of war in the context of Ukraine, that what we see happening in Ukraine is in part, in no small part, due to the failures that Russia has made in the initial stages of the war. The fact that we're now facing an attritional war was not the intent of Russia. So when I wrote the chapter, I needed to really remain conscious of that fact. My chapter lays out a panorama of future visions that we have developed in the Western world over the past 30 years. And what you see is that those visions were informed by technological developments, the impression that we were facing new actors or new strategic context. So there was a while that the strategic discourse was dominated by peacekeeping operations and civil war. In the 2000s, we had counterterrorism and terrorism studies and counterinsurgency. Then afterwards, we moved into the gray zone warfare, the hybrid warfare after 2014 in particular. And all these studies exaggerated their point. On the other hand, They opened up windows that highlighted new specific elements in the strategic landscape. So we should value them for that. All of them, however, agreed that major war was something that was of a diminished risk for the West. In fact, in 2010, the NATO security concept stated that the risk of major war in Europe was actually diminishing. We would probably see it coming within 10 years. 4 years later, we had the annexation of Crimea. So, throughout the past 30 years, the West obtained a limited perspective of war. It was instrumental, whereas other actors that we were bashing against our heads against were actually abiding by a more existential perspective on war, an eschatological perspective. For them, the interests involved were absolute, were total. We forgot that. We had a limited conceptualization of war, whereas the Chinese, for instance, already in 1999 presented us with unrestricted warfare as a concept. So that really limited our thinking, I think. Then, when we come to the war, the war in Ukraine demonstrates that the evolution of war also has periods containing regression instead of progression. We see the primitivization of war, and it's actually, that was Lucas Milewski that introduced that idea, the degradation of expertise and experience, higher formation operation due to attrition in war. You start with a very sophisticated armed force, and due to attrition, that slowly degrades, and all of a sudden you're in medieval tactics and trench warfare. Another aspect, the return of total warfare as a strategic culture. Russia never left total warfare. 30 seconds, all right. The return of industrial war, something we had forgotten. Quantity is a quality in itself. It might not win the war, but it surely poses a problem for us. And some of the expectations turned out to be valid, in particular T.X. Ham's argument about what drones would mean for the battlefield, the transparency on the battlefield, the dominance of the defense over the offense. And for us, that means we need to take another look at the feasibility of maneuver warfare if the battlefield is really transparent. Let me leave it at that.
Excellent. You also deserve compliments for sticking to the time. Thank you, Frans. We're going to move on to Lieutenant Colonel Arnold, and the chapter that he co-wrote is focused on the promise and the practice of cyber.
Thank you. Yes, the next war should have been a cyber war, right? That was the title of our chapter. In recent years, cyberspace was declared a warfighting domain. Nations built their cyber capabilities, they built cyber commands, and they conducted cyber operations, although not in wars. So we really expected to see cyber operations, cyber warfare in this Russian-Ukraine war. Apparently, there was no cyber at all, at least not at first glance. Now, we wanted to analyze the reasons for that. What was it that the Russians were just not prepared, that they just prepared for a 3-day blitzkrieg? Was it that the Russians didn't have any cyber weapons at all? Perhaps they didn't want to escalate or avoid escalation, having second order effects, perhaps in the West, in western part of the world. Perhaps they didn't want to give away their capabilities, their method of operations, etc., etc., etc. So we try to analyze that. If we then look at what we saw in this conflict, then we have to go back to cyber operations related to this very conflict that started in 2014. So the first operation we saw was a manipulation of the elections, where the vote counting machine of the Ukrainian Election Commission was hacked. And the result was, the fixed result was that the ultra-right-wing Dmytro Yarosh, a Nazi, he would win the elections. You may recognize the narrative. In the years thereafter, 2015, 16, and 17, Russia launched several destructive cyber attacks on Ukraine, for example, on the government, but also on their critical infrastructures. Then we go to the war. 2 months before the war, the Russians launched numerous denial of service attacks, defacement attacks showing propaganda, and all kinds of political messages. But also we saw the very first wiperware, that is wiping software, intended to wipe not only data, but also to destroy computers. We saw that prior to the invasion. Then on the very last day, the eve before the invasion, we saw hundreds of denial of service attacks, hundreds of defacements, intelligence gathering operations, and eventually we noticed a destructive wiperware attack on the US company Viasat, and it is a satellite internet communications provider that was also attacked with destructive wiperware. And that was the start of the war. And here I'll stop.
Thank you so much, and also compliments to you. Professor Honig, your chapter focuses very much on the role of the people in conflict, and there's also a substantial focus on history, which very much speaks to me as an historian.
Thank you. I'll try and stick within the time, but I'm sure I won't. I was reminded with the first opening question by Rob de Wijk that why don't we learn from history? That my answer would have been we've got too many realists and we've got too many bad strategists. But I'm not allowed to talk about that. I have to talk about my chapter, but you can ask me questions about it later. What I was struck by is a sort of a fundamental continuity in modern Western history between the idea of people's war involving the people in war and the idea of professional war, where we've seen since the French Revolution the emergence of the idea that war should be, to quote Clausewitz, the business of the people. The reason for that being that the people with the French Revolution are put at the center of politics. There is the idea that politics should serve the people. That means that the people should serve politics. In a democracy, you would expect that all the people who vote for their government, a form of governance, will also serve in the military in order to defend their system of governance. You see that that idea is also picked up by the other major political ideologies. In communism, you expect that the proletariat will defend the communist system and spread it across the world. You also see it in fascism, that the fascist ideology also assumes that there is a fundamental connection between the people and war and its necessity to defend a particular type of politics. But if you then survey the past 2 centuries of our history, particularly in Europe, what you see is that that idea, even though it has a fundamental logic to it, to all the political systems that we see develop and the political ideologies that we see develop across Europe, which have an influence on the rest of the world as well, you see that there is a resistance against involving the people in war, which raises the question why that is. And it also can be linked immediately to contemporary conflict. Am I already at the end?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. You can also see it in Ukraine, where initially we thought that Ukraine was saved by the people standing up and defending their political system. Now we see that the Ukrainians are running low on manpower. We also see that on the Russian side. And the regimes on both sides, the democratic and the authoritarian, are hesitating to declare conscription. They are fearful, and there are the motives, but you can ask me what the motives then are, since the 30 seconds are up. Both regime types have problems with declaring conscription and involving the people in war. That is a very interesting question why that is. Final sentence. In the Netherlands, we got this debate now about weerbaarheid, which you can't translate into English, which is interesting. No, resilience is not a good translation of the idea of weerbaarheid. That has completely different connotations, but the idea is that somehow the people need to step up again and be prepared to defend their country and their political system. But we fear, we are nervous about why and whether they will actually want to do that. Why is that? Okay.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to move to Dr. Van Hooft, who has contributed a chapter focused on coercion and denial, and there's a lot of emphasis on denial strategies.
Right, so I'm prematurely chastened by your timekeeping, so I'll try to really stick to the points. So this is part of a longer-term project, line of thought I developed, where I see, and other analysts see, a long-term trend towards increasing ability to deny access to actors. And I mean long-term as in over the last 150 years at the very least. There's several key drivers here. That's the increasing rate of firepower, so the amount of destructiveness that gets launched at a combatant, the precision of those attacks, the range at which this happens, right? Moving from machine guns to artillery to air power to long-range missiles. And I talk about that in a military sense, but I also see that increasing opportunity for access and denial over longer distances in economic terms as well. However, what the point of the chapter is that these trends do not affect all actors equally. So while we've, like in the Red Sea, for example, we've seen increasing access, abilities to deny access to shipping by a very small scale, very limited actor, the Houthis. Not all states or small actors can really gain the kind of capabilities to stop other actors from getting close in range. For major states, for great powers, the ability to deny access at long range and the ability to overcome the denial capabilities of others still is actually unchallengeable. So if you think about this as a constant competition, for radar you get stealth, for stealth you get attempts at better air defenses, you get better stealth, you get longer range weapons. Point is that at the top of this competition, there's only a few states that can really gain access to those technologies, use them properly, and deny access to those technologies to other states. So what the Ukraine war shows is that actually for Russia, who had a great deal of difficulty overcoming at least at the tactical and theater levels, overcoming the denial capabilities of the Ukrainians, but so which shows kind of, that there's a lot of great deal of that innovation at the level of the peoples, great deal of innovation at the tactical level, the use of UAVs and so on. But at the same time, that is not a lesson that can easily be applied to what would happen if the US would face Russia or if the US and China face each other. So this is kind of, to wrap it up, we have to think not about one kind of future war to prepare for, but really different kind of combinations of actors with very different kinds of capabilities, both to stop others from operating in their vicinity and their own ability or lack thereof to overcome that denial capability of others. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. We're now going to turn to Dr. Hoytink, who contributed a chapter with two co-authors, and she's speaking on their behalf as well. And the focus on in the chapter is on the military-industrial commercial complex. And this chapter, I think, stands out because it uses a very refreshing theoretical lens of assemblage theory.
Thanks, Isabel. Yes, indeed. So the chapter is co-authored, is actually largely based on ethnographic fieldwork by Linda Arendts, a PhD candidate and former colleague of Tim Sweijs at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. So I want to indeed mention her especially. But the chapter is also part of my ongoing research into new and advanced technologies and how they change the way in which we think about, the ways in which we fight, but also the ways in which we live warfare. Plus, it's based on ongoing work into how this happens increasingly, or how the implementation and development of technologies happens in an increasingly experimental way, both in terms of, or both through experimental activities, but also through new and experimental partnerships or assemblages indeed with new and commercial actors. And in that sense, the Ukraine war is not really changing much of my thinking. In fact, the Ukraine war has, by many commentators, been identified as a lab, a laboratory, an experimental field lab testing space for the development and implementation of new warfighting technologies, particularly those related to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Of course, as we've seen in the first panel or in the first discussion, in collaboration or in conjunction also with more conventional ways of warfighting. And this idea of Ukraine as a lab or a testing space has been, or applies and has been also adopted by Ukraine itself, by the Ukrainian military, which is very much building on these ideas to establish its army of drones. It's also something that's adopted by allies. The US is openly discussing or talking about Ukraine as its own laboratory for instance, its automated decision projects, Project Maven, but also by private partners. This is what the chapter deals with mostly. So the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, talks about Ukraine as this is our Oppenheimer moment. And within the Netherlands, we have Evalor AI, which is a company that we trace in the chapter, which also recently, and this was quoted by the NOS, talks about its collaborations with the Ukrainian military as very important or a valuable opportunity to test its technology in a real battlefield setting. So again, this is not necessarily new. These partnerships and experimental practices have long been in the making, but we are at a critical moment, I think, in terms of asking urgent questions related to how we can actually trace lines of responsibility, of accountability and democratic control, and how we can be present in those moments of development and design, and also hold those accountable who are involved in the critical making of these new systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All the panelists have given us lots to think about, but I'm going to give you more in terms of a second round, even quicker than the first. And we're going to ask them, so what are the lessons? What should we learn? And also, if they so prefer, what should we not learn from the war in Ukraine? Professor Ozinga.
Right. First of all, the arrival of strategic reach with the proliferation of airborne and seaborne drones for a range of actors. Second, the challenges of air missile defense in the face of waves of drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. The numbers are staggering. Just in 1 month, Ukraine suffered 4,000 missiles and drone attacks. This points to a third point, the strategic impact of air denial and the failure to achieve air superiority and defend yourself. If you don't have air superiority, basically that's what's happening right now in Ukraine. The default strategy for both parties is basically attrition strategy. Attrition strategy is not a viable strategy for the West. In fact, it may not be a viable strategy for Russia. Quantity matters, but the war shows the limits, right? Russia has lost 450,000 soldiers, right? Right now it has 500,000 soldiers, and it only has the Donbass to show for it. So attrition might actually not work, but we need to prepare for it. Enemies learn, what should we not learn? Enemies learn and adapt. Do not expect Russia to make the same mistake again if it ponders to challenge a NATO country. We need to think about societal resilience very quickly. Look at what's happening in Finland. Finland is doing very well. And the West needs to relearn the foundations of deterrence and escalation management. Too often and too long, we have deterred ourselves, too afraid of escalation. And I think we didn't do ourselves, nor the Ukrainians, a service. And I think it's very important now that you see various countries, including ours, pondering actually to deploy troops for support missions in Ukraine. Finally, as Christopher Coker said in the final excellent epilogue to the chapter, we live in an era of unpeace. We see, NATO has warned for that last week, we see all sorts of sabotage activities, cyber activities in Europe taking place. Cameron has said we live in an era equivalent to 1938. And Macron last week said, Europe is in mortal dangers. There are 3 distinct dangers. One of them is Russia. The other one are the societal developments taking place in our societies right now. The rise of anti-Semitism and the extreme right. Let's leave it at that.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Arnolds.
Thank you. We have 5 conclusions. At first, maybe an open door, but war will be fought, and not only war, but also great power competition and conflict and war will be fought in all domains, land, sea, air, and cyberspace. All dimensions of the information environment will be used. That is physical, that is virtual, that is cognitive. And all instruments of power will be used. Speaking of unpeace, cyber warfare may not be decisive in wartime. It will play a great role during peacetime or unpeace time. Second point is that cyber warfare is not limited to the geographical war zone, so where the actual fighting takes place. So cyberspace is way larger. So that means that third parties, actors from other states, may involve in the fighting. On the opposite, targets from other states may become objects from other states may be targets in that same war. So we have other another space with other borders. Then the third point is the role of ICT firms and big tech companies. Unlike land, sea, and air, cyberspace is fully man-made. It is created, developed, maintained by the big tech companies. On the one hand, they facilitate cyber warfare, so they make it possible. On the other hand, the same hardware and software is also target in the same war. That is a very strange situation. So they're part of the problem and part of the solution. Then the fourth point is the extensive use of computers and internet, social media platforms for spreading narratives, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, etc., etc. So there's an extensive use and it will grow. And finally, we will think that destructive wiperware, so wiping malware, destructive wiperware, will play a greater role in future conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move to Professor Honig.
Thanks. What I would say the major lesson of Ukraine is that war is too serious a business to be left to the military professional. And by that I mean that the military tends to have a preference for a particular type of war with particular means. The modern military, and we have supported that with our modern ideas of civil-military relations, which basically means the military are professional, they do their bit, we are civilians, and we do our bit. What the military have as an idea of war isn't quite appropriate for the types of conflict that we face. The first problem is that the military are not political enough. Yeah? Although we all say war is a continuation of politics by other means, we still think that means that when war starts, politics ends. We are not sufficiently attuned, neither civil society nor the military, that war is suffused at all times by politics. The second thing is, because we see the military professional as a separate profession done by what is in effect a minority of people, it has tended to become excessively technocratic. It relies on equipment that is far too complex. And most of the stuff is prone to break down. You run out of it, you can't quickly replace it. As a result of that, what you see in Ukraine is a simplification of war, which is, with longer wars, a normal process. Think of the First World War, it became more and more simple. Think of the Second World War, it became simpler and simpler after Blitzkrieg failed. So the effect of that is that it draws in more and more people who fight under more and more brutal conditions. It is time for civil society to pay more careful attention to what the military think and plan to do, because it will come and bite you if you don't pay attention. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. van Hoofd.
Thank you. So what the lessons are that we shouldn't take away from Ukraine, and that it's radically different from things we've seen in the past. It's just one other step in a continuous evolution of warfare over the last 100, 150 years, where you get increased precision, increased overrange, more firepower, with just keep new elements added into this, kind of intensifying those things that are already there. So for example, the introduction of UAVs, of drones in the early stages of the war was seen as a game changer, revolutionary, until there was a counter response to it, right? That kind of hypey stories in the Washington Post and New York Times died down after the summer of 2022. That doesn't mean that they don't matter. It means that everything gets incorporated into this, I think, larger thesis of, you know, if you can be seen, you can be killed. It is actually quite hard to master these complex systems, and that, in that sense, I really agree with the previous speaker. You can see that what is surprising, that the Russians weren't able to gain air superiority that Ukrainian air defenses seem to hold with outside assistance, but still, that was remarkable. We've seen more and more reporting coming out that Russian satellite information was not up to date, that real-time reconnaissance was not, space-based reconnaissance were not working, the airborne radars were shot down, were not properly protected. Point is that we're seeing an evolution where there's going to be a very select class of actors, of great power states, that are going to be able to manage all these technologies that have to do with sensing things at great distances, reliably, in real time, and also hiding from them if needed, right? It's going to be very hard, it's already very hard for everyone outside of the US to have very good stealth bombers, for example, or to really master the ability to fuse all these long-range data information from radars, from space-based information, and so on. That is also going to apply to other technologies where AI gets maybe perhaps further developed and integrated into the sensor networks, data fusion, and so on. So there's really going to be a multi-tiered international system in that sense.
Thank you. Dr. Hoytink.
Yes, so there's of course much debate today, but also more generally in security studies literature about the ways in which the technologies that we are describing in the chapter and that are part of my research are either revolutionary or evolutionary, how to view them, and relatedly also the extent to which they are really changing or really giving Ukraine also competitive edge in this specific war, especially also against the background of some of the latest developments there. But beyond those questions, I think I find it important to point out how those technologies are clearly changing the experiences of those who fight and of the citizens who undergo them. So in more military speak, perhaps, as Tim was saying, they may not have strategic effects yet, but they do have clear tactical effects. And those experiences in Ukraine and definitely also in Gaza show us two things. So there's two takeaways for me here. And again, this is mostly from the perspective of civilians in warfare or from the perspective of conflict studies. One is that we see additional forms or different forms of civilian harm in relation to these new technologies, both in terms of the ways in which they increase the speed and scale of warfare, but also in the sense that they lead to new compounding forms of violence. For instance, in the context of the Ukraine war, we see a company like Clearview AI unrolling facial recognition technology in this war, which may be a legitimate tool to win a legitimate war, but at the same time it may also have important repercussions in the long run, leading to mass surveillance, for instance. Another second point I wanted to mention is related to the difficulty of regulating these systems, particularly in the context of this very complex military-industrial commercial complex we see in the Netherlands and also in the US drive towards responsible use of military AI, but this of course is is very difficult to maintain and really to control in a context in which companies, US companies, high-tech companies are directly delivering or providing their technologies to the Ukrainian military or to Israel. So this is really sort of complicating, I think, also our regulatory efforts that are going on right now.
Thank you. There is lots on the table now to discuss and debate. I want to abuse my position as chair just slightly by offering two further observations. I couldn't help but notice that a lot of emphasis, both in this fireside chat and in the roundtable just now, has been on capabilities, on technology, on instruments. A lot less has been focused on the other main ingredient if you talk about war, namely political will to fight. Does that mean that we are largely not addressing this because of the continuity that we're observing? I find that a fascinating aspect. A second one, and I think for me the strong point in the book, was the shifting between different lenses and different perspectives. And the book is in particular strong that every chapter offers a different lens to study the same phenomena. And it's very worthwhile to think about the future, if you ask me, by using multiple perspectives and multiple lenses. On that note, I'm going to look at the organizers. There's 2 microphones on offer, and I would like to invite the audience to raise your hand, briefly introduce yourself, and pose your question, preferably in a short and sharp manner.
Yeah, one microphone has an empty battery, so I'll just, if you point to where I have to go, I'll run.
Let's start here in the front.
Hello. So good afternoon. My name is Jean-Yves Nzanam. My name is Jean-Yves Nzanam. I'm a PhD owner here at Leiden University, and I have a question for Professor Jan Hullem regarding the implication of civilians in the military strategy of a state. You rightly pointed out that war is a too serious business to be left only in the hands of professional militaries. But my question is, what's your take regarding the, let's say, the risk that leaders also run by implying civilians in the warfare or, let's say, war strategy? What I mean by that is, do you think that there's a risk of being exposed by, let's say, check and balance systems, for example, constitutional observations, in the case, for example, of Russia and Ukraine, like by implying more and more people, you think that maybe regimes, the deficiencies of the regime will be exposed and it will have a backfiring effect on the strategy? Thank you.
Shall we take the questions one by one, or shall we collect a couple? Maybe. Yeah, there's so many hands up, so maybe start over there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. The four's two rows.
First, thanks everybody. I'm Davis Ellison, a colleague of Paul's from HCSS, but also a PhD candidate in war studies in King's College in London. 2 kind of quick questions, one to Paul and then to Professor Honig. First to Paul, I'm curious this concept of denial and how we think about it, particularly in other contexts for European states. How much of the concerns about denial are really informed by the U.S. military's view of its challenges in Eastern Europe and the Taiwan Straits? And then secondly to Professor Honig, the relationship of people to war and to the state and a lot of the discussions that have been happening now because of the Ukraine war. How realistic is it, the conversations that we hear, just 2 off the top of my head, in Germany and the United Kingdom about the reintroduction of conscription? Is that something that's politically feasible or militarily necessary? Thank you.
My name is Paul Meerts. I'm here working here at Leiden University. What does the book say about the strategic impact of negotiation on warfare?
Yeah, we'll take 2 more questions there. Ernst, second row. then we'll move to the other side of the room.
My name is Uri. I do the Crisis and Security Management Master, the War and Peace Studies track. And I was wondering what you believe about the role of companies in terms of denying certain services, like Elon Musk threatened to do with access to satellites for Ukraine.
My name is Ferdy Beer. I'm a Dutch influencer in Indonesia, also for the G20. I start with a quote. In the midst of the chaos, there is also opportunity. A quote from the book The Art of War. A future personal question to you. Ukraine lost. The Russians are coming to Europe. What kind of courage do you need as a leader and a smart patriotic students in this audience when the Russians are coming? A question from you as officer.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm a PhD candidate at Dutch Defense Academy in Leiden University. I have a question for Professor Ozinga and Honig, depending on the term I use. How does a resilient or weerbare society today look like?
What?
A resilient society or a weerbare society? How do you think
how does it work?
How does it look like
What
according to you?
Okay. Yeah. Who wants to start? Yeah, okay. Paul.
Okay. Thanks for the question, Davis. So denial really matters to the US because the US is an outside power everywhere it operates, right? It's not in Europe, it's not in Asia, it's not in the Middle East as its actual physical location. It has to cross the Atlantic, it has to cross the Pacific, it has to build bases or some kind of launch points far, far away from home all across the planet. So it also needs the kind of capabilities that can easily get to the doorstep of a potential adversary, and it needs to do this reliably, so otherwise all of the states that are allied to it, whether they're in Europe, whether they're in Asia, right, whether it's Poland, whether it's Japan or Korea, will stop really believing that the US can protect them. And there are some consequences if they don't believe that. So for the US, it is essential that it can project power, and that means that for all its adversaries or potential adversaries, it's essential to raise the cost for US power projection, which is the Chinese investment in anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, mid-range ballistic missiles that can destroy air bases, all these kind of weapons, but also at a much more limited scale, defense industrial limited scale, what Iran tries to do in the Persian Gulf and by proxy in the Red Sea. So for the US, if it wants to play its role as a global hegemon, overcoming denial and forcing access is crucial. If you reverse that, if you look at it from a European perspective, a NATO European perspective or whatever, then actually maybe investing in robust denial capabilities might be more than enough to kind of blunt any serious Russian threat, which then also creates the opportunity, if Russia can no longer leverage its military capabilities to any serious effect, that also creates the room for some kind of, at some point post-Ukraine war, security settlement for security architecture for the rest of Europe. So the point is these two things are not, these technologies, whether it's technologies, the difficulties in applying them, the defense industrial bases, not all powers need to do the same thing. That depends on their context, that depends on the strategy, what they're trying to accomplish for themselves. And those are not the same for all of them.
All right, Frans, Willem.
Thanks for all the questions that I've got, I think, 5 out of the 6 to say something about, or 4 out of the 6. The civilian one is a really important one, a very complicated one. What I would say very quickly about that is that the civilian as a category that needs to be distinguished in and from war is a very modern invention. It only appears in international law after the First World War. Now, even though we use it all the time and we also use it back in history, we get very confused as a result of that what we think, and then it's a Western concept as well, are civilians, a Western liberal concept, I should add, is a particular category of people that may have some use at a particular point in history, but it doesn't make us think about the ways throughout history discrimination has been applied in war and warfare by antagonists. Even at the time of, say, the 80 Years' War, the Dutch Revolt, when we accused the Spanish of being indiscriminately brutal against us, that is, nothing could be further from the truth. They are brutal, but they are brutal in a very discriminatory fashion. And it is very important for us to understand how this discrimination, which applies in warfare always throughout history, maybe Jews, genocide, World War II, Nazis is an exception, but it tends to apply in all other conflict, is something that should be studied very carefully. The second one is the reintroduction of conscription. Rob de Wijk mentioned that, oh, he's disappeared. Anyway, he mentioned that we're being too alarmist. I think I agree. This will probably, the pressure to reintroduce conscription will wane, because I don't see the Russians having really any intention or capability to come and visit us with their armed forces. What may though happen, or what we can then avoid, is that because we probably can't find enough enthusiastic youngsters to join the armed forces, and conscription will be objected to, that the armed forces will invest even more in technology than they're already doing. And that doesn't necessarily prepare us very well for the next conflict, whatever form that may take. Professional forces may be an outdated concept. Negotiation in warfare is a very good question. Traditionally, wars in Europe for certain, but I'm pretty sure in the rest of the world as well, were always accompanied by negotiations between the parties. Warfare, fighting, negotiation were inextricably linked. It is only during the 19th century in Europe that you see the two things separate, that fighting becomes something you do during war, negotiation is something that you do after war, if you do it. Yeah? It is more an idea that you impose, the victor imposes his idea of peace upon the loser. So this points to what I've earlier mentioned, that we've got a particular idea of war that means that we exclude the idea of being able to negotiate with an opponent. And we see the opponent more and more in criminal terms, which wasn't historically the case. And therefore, if you see your opponent as a criminal, you can't negotiate with the person, the party. You put them in prison or you execute them at the end of war. Okay, what was the last one? Weerbare maatschappij. Yeah, what does a resilient society look like? If you take history as inspiration, it looks like a totalitarian society, where kiddies are born with the prospect of becoming part of a fighting society. You go to school and you join the military wing of the Boy Scouts. You learn your fighting skills. You go to university, you learn war studies. And if you think of war studies at King's, the origin of the University of London and King's College London teaching on war is a product of the First World War. It is a part of an idea that society, after the First World War, when the Second World War comes around, as is certain, the belief at the time is, you must educate civil society for war. Do we want that? We want that. I think war studies in its modern guise, I hope that former students will support that idea, hopefully teaches a more sophisticated idea of how we should think and what we should think about war and the role of society in it. Okay.
Right. I happen to disagree with a couple of points that has just been brought up as a former military, former general. You could make the argument over the past 30 years that decision-making on war has become way too politicized. And actually, James Fearon, a specialist in civil military relationship, has made that argument that currently, in particular because of the Vietnam War in the US, the military are heavily educated on politics. And they know full well that politics is always surrounding, informing, dictating what strategy is all about. Politics sets the strategic objectives, policy sets the constraints. The generals are very politics savvy. It is the politicians that have become naive about war. In the past 30 years, we've seen operations, for instance, in the Balkan, also the peace operations, where strategy was heavily constrained. And I think it was Rob de Wijk who said, what we've done over in the Kosovo, for instance, was fighting with one arm tied behind our back. We've lost the essence of strategic logic sometimes because of political influence. That is not a criticism, but it is a counter-argument to saying that war is too important to be left to the generals. We haven't left war to the generals over the past 30 years. And one of the reasons I've been so intent on creating a war studies program here at Leiden, also at the Defense Academy, was to at least trying to keep the flame alive on how to study war and what war is all about. All the horrific aspects of war, not glorifying war, but the complexity, the difficulty, the multidimensionality of war. And so I do agree that civilians should be heavily involved in the strategy process, but that's already the case. Right? Our Chief of Defense Staff is completely surrounded by civilians in the Ministry of Defense. He's just one voice. If you look at NATO, the SACEUR, the most senior commander, the Foresight General, is just one voice among many, and all of them are civilian. That is precisely the Western canon, that politics dominates war. Politics dominates strategy, and if you don't, war will actually start to dominate politics. You don't want that. That's one of the teachings of Clausewitz. So there's one counterpoint I want to make about complexity and technology. Without complex technology, you can't survive in war these days. Right? Without the F-35, we're not up against, for instance, the most recent generations of surface-to-air missiles. Right? I've heard the same argument with the F-16. In fact, the Netherlands Air Force experimental pilot who needed to assess the F-16 said, the F-16 is way too complex for our pilots. Well, guess what? The F-16 has been a very influential, very useful tool over the past 30 years. We can deal with complexity. If we can deal with cyber, if all of you can learn how to operate a mobile phone, which has more than 1 million codes of computer programming, right? There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to operate sophisticated air defense systems, sophisticated drones. So the point about complexity is it has to have a purpose. But you can't, if you don't have complex technology, your opponent will actually abuse that. You're creating a vulnerability. Resilience. Our Ministry of Defense gave a great speech 3 weeks ago. Resilience comes from a close cooperation between the government, the private sector, semi-government, but also private citizens. The Ministry of Economic Affairs was there from Ukraine, the former Ministry of Economic Affairs. He said, listen, the first week of the war, you're on your own as a civilian. The government is trying to sustain governmental functionalities. That's what resilience is all about. But as a household, you should be resilient also. The Swedes, after 2014, the Swedish government sent 4.8 million leaflets to households in Sweden, telling them that at one day, right, don't be surprised if internet doesn't work, gas doesn't come from the stove. Be resilient on a household basis. Don't expect the government to come to your aid. Be resilient. As a society, the government will try to maintain the functioning of the infrastructure. We have privatized our infrastructure, most of it. We need to return to a situation where the private sector retains redundancies and buffers. And right now, our various ministries of our government are actually talking to the private sector, the energy sector, the railroad sector, to actually recreate that. We had that during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was actually an organization called Bescherming Bevolking, the protection of the civilization, of the civil population. We will readdress that. Actually, the AIV the Advisory Council on International Affairs, will publish a paper on resilience in the face of hybrid attacks. So there's a role to play for the government. There's a role to play for the military, a limited role. There's a role to play for the private sector and for civilians. Now, when it comes to conscription, Western societies have become very reluctant to talk about that, but slowly a debate is emerging again to talk about what we in the Netherlands call the dienstjaar, which has become rather popular. Defense College is a construct that has become rather popular. I discover in my lectures, in my MA course on war studies, that the young people, as you are, know what's happening out there in the world and understand that at some point our societies may actually be threatened. And there's a role to play for them. Things are changing. We are leaving the strategic pose of the 90s and 2000 behind, and people realize that we have gone through a paradigm change. So I'm not that pessimistic. Conscription might actually not be necessary for a country like the Netherlands. Conscription won't help the Navy. They need technicians to maintain their radar systems. It won't help the Air Force necessarily. It will help the Army. Conscription is very valuable for the Swedes, the Finns, the Baltic states, the Poles, and the Germans, for instance. And they will probably, also the Germans, might actually reinstate conscription. So I'm a bit more optimistic about it.
We clearly have a disagreement here regarding the political domain, political military decision making, and I've just been given a signal that Paul wants to come in on that.
Sure. I'll just keep that very short, but just to respond, I mean, it's going to be very much in line, I guess, with France's comments, but to respond to Jan Willem as well. Yeah, we can absolutely abhor war, but studying it, talking about it, thinking about it should not be suspect in any way. When I did my dissertation 10, 15 years ago at the University of Amsterdam, it was suspect. You were considered suspect almost to think about it and to talk about it. And I don't think that really helps, right? Because now we have a generation, or the last generation that really studied nuclear weapons seriously, for example, is now all in their late 60s or 70s, right? And Rob has already left the room. But that is a problem, right? There's the handful of people in their 30s and 40s that actually, in the Netherlands, that actually talk about it are pretty much all in the room right now. That also means that in the ministries, there's very few people who can actually talk about this, I think, somewhat or really cohesively and coherently, and they're also in this room. So, you know, you get real limits, even if you care about things, you know, whether you kind of abhor the idea of nuclear deterrence, but if you care about things like arms control or maybe even disarmament, you need knowledge, you need to understand what's at stake, you need to know what's going on. The same if you want if you're worried that the military runs the show, which I think in a country like the Netherlands is very hard to believe. But in terms of like having specialized knowledge that's inaccessible, that means you also get a very poor civilian decision making. All right? I don't think we have it right now, but it could have been a lot better. It's hard to have certain discussions. So if you care about a good state of civil-military relations, ignorance is not your friend. People need to understand what this is actually about. If you want to make a sensible decision on, you know, the prospects for negotiation in Ukraine, you cannot do this just on your fields, right? So deeper knowledge, structured over time, that's our bigger friend. It's ridiculous how little time and effort we really spend on this compared to whatever, right? Every defense acquisition or everything else we spend. So anyway, that was kind of my 2 cents on that point.
All right, I'd like to give Marijn and Karsten an opportunity to respond to any of the first round of questions. Yes, Marijn first.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about both the question about Starlink, but also about the will to fight, or the absence of the will to fight. Of course, there's now some research on this, including by colleagues at the Vrije Universiteit, former colleagues. But to me, it doesn't really surprise me that this is the case, and that's not because of the fact that we live in a postmodern society, or that we have become decadent or feminine, as some far right parties would like us to believe. But it is part of a longer trajectory of waging war at a distance. So we haven't been experiencing war fighting in such a way, and it is It's part of that recent history where of remote warfare, as we call it in the literature, that we haven't really been in contact with war as it is. So it doesn't surprise me in that respect. Regarding the question related to the interdependence or the dependence on private companies and the example of Starlink, yes. So I think it's really a sort of a critical case that underlines the infrastructural power of many of these companies, SpaceX, but also some of the big tech companies that my colleague was talking about. If I can advertise my new project, I have a project, Platform Wars. I'm looking for new PhD students very soon. So if you're interested, if any of you is interested, please follow me on these platforms. But I think indeed we do see a growing dependence on companies like SpaceX, but also Amazon and Google and their cloud services. They're highly important in the war in Ukraine. They're highly important, or so it seems, in the war in Gaza. I talked about Palantir, a company that claims to be responsible for most of the targeting currently being done in Ukraine. Of course, we should take that with some grain of salt, but it does testify to the fact that they are very increasingly important in these very critical decisions. And so we can have a debate about whether this is a form of weaponized interdependence, the Farrell and Newman argument, or whether we see really a shift of power residing in the hands of private companies. And I think if we look at other domains, education, transportation, tourism, then we do see that a similar sort of shift towards these companies, and their power is definitely at stake, also in the military, although it will probably be more complex in this particular domain. So that's really what the project will be interested in and zoom in on.
Okay, thank you. I would like to respond to that particular question as well, the role of civilian companies. I'll try not to duplicate. The attack on the US-based Viasat, the satellite internet communications provider, that was part of the story because the problem was solved by Elon Musk's Starlink, as you mentioned. Elon Musk redirected his satellites, facilitating internet communications via satellite. He also sent ship's loads of satellite receivers, and it solved the problems for the Ukrainians who were virtually blind. The military were virtually blind north of Kiev, where this large 60-kilometer tank column was waiting to invade Ukraine. So that problem was solved. But the story continues because a few months later, Ukraine wanted to use the same Starlink satellite system for attacking Crimea. And Elon Musk didn't want that. Now imagine a CEO of a commercial company deciding the targets and what may or may not be used in wartime. Just consider that. When the war started, when the invasion started, just prior to the invasion, Ukraine transferred its digital crown jewels to Microsoft. Luckily they did, because the Russian attacked all the servers where all those digital crown jewels were stored. So good for them. But on the other hand, Microsoft is a commercial company. And of course, the US is still the friend of Ukraine, but well, what about the future? Who can guarantee that all these commercial parties are still our friends in the future? You never know. It gives them power. They won't do it for free. They did in the first months. After that, someone had to pay. I'm concerned about the role of civilian companies when it comes to conflict and fighting. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to look at the organizers. Can we take one more round of questions? Oh, not really. Oh dear. Are you going to come?
Very short ones.
Okay, you've got the microphone, so it's up to you.
Like 3 very short ones. Start.
Hi. What are the lessons we can learn from Ukraine regarding the future of the politics of warfare? You've touched upon this, but there are several things there are several things that politicians limited in the war in Ukraine. So there's limitations of what sort of weapons to use. There's limitations concerning let's not escalate with Russia. There's limitations concerning domestically what sort of weapons can we send and can we not send. So what lessons has the Ukrainian war taught about the politics of warfare?
Thank you. My question responds to the premise of war being irrational and how the irrationality of waging war made Europe consider it impossible for 30 years. But given that despite its irrationality, it occurred, it says that there is perhaps an emotional element here that was dangerously underestimated. So emotion seems to be a vital element to why states choose to wage war and why civilians choose to fight for their countries. Is this perhaps a missing element in Europe? An emotion tied to one's country, even, dare we say, nationalism that is vital to fighting? And has Europe, sorry, I'm wrapping up, has Europe perhaps shot itself in the foot by being too rational? And very practically, how likely would European countries, in your view, be to, for example, fight for the Baltics if needed in the next few years?
I have a very short question. A couple of 100 meters, they were trying to establish a new political base for the government. If they have not read that book and talk to you about at the reception, what are the lessons the new government should take from this book?
All right, it's going to be a matter of seconds now. So, Jan Willem, any aspect that you want to highlight? Your last chance to put your stamp on proceedings.
Emotion and irrationality are really interesting things when it comes to war. That we often see violence as an irrational thing, and war is something that escapes from our control. And that is supposed to be due to emotion getting the better of us. That doesn't quite seem to be the case. War, in terms as understood as organized violence, is something that you have to work on, and you've got to have some kind of reason to convince all those people to be part of your organization and to go to war. Also, the idea that war automatically escalates once you start fighting against an opponent, that doesn't quite seem to be the case either. What you have in the end is that people go to war for certain reasons. They encounter people who are willing to take up the fight for certain reasons, and they have it out with one another. And usually in history, they come to some kind of agreed ending. The weird thing that we have had in the West is that we've seen war increasingly as something that is essentially a criminal activity. We've banned war except in self-defense, which presumes that the person who starts, or the party that starts war, is committing a criminal act. And that influences our view, our vision of the enemy, and that influences the reason we apply, but also the behavior we mete out to our enemy and how we deal with him at the end. And I already referred to the idea that we don't usually negotiate an ending, we impose an ending. So yeah, it's a very good question, and there's a lot more to be said about it. Can I quickly react to Frans about the thing to pay attention to? Frans's reaction to my, well, one has to be a bit polemical here because you want to engage the audience, is when he mentioned it is the politicians who let the military fight with one arm tied behind their back. Think of the implication. The military want to fight with both arms. What is at the end of both arms? It is two fists. What do they want? They want to use more force. Yes.
You'll find most generals will generally advise against using force. So,
they would know
no.
once they start.
Oh man, you have a very stereotypical image of military, stemming from the 70s perhaps, but we've actually progressed. Restrictions, very dangerous indeed. Very dangerous. Too many restrictions have been applied on Western weapon systems that we gave to the Ukrainians. That's actually
restrictions regarding what?
too many restrictions. First of all, on supplying weapons and then using force against Russian installation right across the border. For instance, right now against Kharkov. Ukraine is being invaded, and there's every international right legislation that then justifies using force against those military activities. The White House is now coming back from that stance, fortunately. War is irrational. Ego in Russia, in the Kremlin, is a major factor. Deterrence fails sometimes because of ego considerations, because war is not necessarily the worst outcome, because of internal rivals. For the Kremlin, war has remained a very instrumental, very logical, rational instrument. It is us that we have, I agree in that with Jan Willem, we have unlearned war. During the 90s, or actually there's a backlash of 70s and 80s. It was John Muller who said, war has become sub-rationally unthinkable. He actually called it Hollandization, a virus that went through the political military elite in our societies in the 70s and 80s. We've unlearned war. We need to relearn it. Not to fight it, but to recognize when you need to use force, if necessary.
All right, Paul, really briefly.
Of course. Now, the question about rationality or irrationality, I think that sort of builds on what was just been said. It's both, all the time, right? There's a rational component. It's rational to use force to get what you want, and it's rational to use force to stop someone from taking something. It is emotional to be nationalistic. It's emotional to be a pacifist and to believe that that will be sufficient. All of these things, you can mix them up how you want, right? I don't think there's one meta thesis that really does justice to the complexity of war and the implications of it, right, which are very serious, obviously. And on the lessons learned of the Ukraine war for politics, well, for a very basic one, the boring ones are always the best lessons, right? Scale. You need to produce things at a decent level. You need to have the stuff ready. You need to think years in advance on these things if you care about defending yourself or defending others. And these are all kind of the non-sexy, things that not shiny, fly fast, all that stuff, but still need to be all in order and organized. And I'll leave that up.
Marijn. Arnold? Please join me in thanking the panelists for what was a very eventful panel.
Thank you all for being here. I would have really liked to see this discussion pan out further. That's how science progresses, but through disagreement. But you can join us for drinks afterwards at Pavlov, which is not at the plein, as I said, but at the end of the Spuis. So take a left at the exit and continue walking until you see the pub, or follow Tim towards it. These things really only succeed by strict timekeeping, so my compliments to Professor Duivenstein. And I learned a lot. I learned that the past, learning from the past might be just as difficult as predicting the future, and that depends is a perfectly reasonable answer to all academic questions. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for writing the book and organizing this. And I hope to see you all at Pavlov for drinks. Oh, and you can buy the book, 40% discount. So if you're quick, thanks.